What up? Oh man, I'm gonna be talking about everything you need to know, right? So I'll share my screen in a second. You can rewatch this anytime. This video will be here. You know, you can go back to it. There we go. All right, my friends. So for those of you that are feeling right now like you're a 2-3, my hope is that you leave tonight feeling like a 3-4. All right, at least a 4. I want you guys feeling like 4s at least when you leave. I mean, hopefully you feel like a 5, but at the very least feel like a 4. APUSH cram session. If you're not following us on social media, get there. We're posting so many memes. We have Claire, our in-house meme lord, meme lady, meme queen, whatever you want to call it.
Lord.
Meme lord. She wants to be a lord, so she's a lord.
I'm not a lady, I'm a lord.
All right, so first I'm going to go through some like really big ideas for each time period. So like big takeaways that you should know about each period in APUSH, right? Like what are those like major things that come up? Keep in mind, period 1 is like this much of your test. It's 5%, which means there'll be like one set of multiple choice questions, and that's like it. You're not going to see much more than that. If I have to go and come back, can you replay? Yes. All right, so don't spend a lot of time on period 1. Like literally spend 5% of your studying time on period 1 because you don't need it that much. But really quick takeaways. Native American tribes were very complex. We call the group of people Native Americans, but that's such an umbrella term. There are lots of different tribes with different traditions, very unique religions, cultural beliefs. And so, you know, there were a lot of different people that existed here that were diverse. And the Europeans themselves didn't really acknowledge that. They just sort of saw Native Americans and didn't necessarily see them as any sort of differences between them. It was just sort of like all lumped in, right? And so that was a problem that led to a lot of conflict. The Europeans themselves come to America because they want, this is the like God, glory, gold, right? They want wealth, they want to spread Christianity, and they want to gain military status, right? They want to expand their empire. Which of course leads to widespread epidemics in Native communities. I think it's like, what was it, like 90% of Native Americans died because of diseases, and then forced labor systems until there really were no natives left, and there were very few natives left. And so that's when the Europeans then turned to Africa for slaves. Europeans and natives are not besties, as you know, lots of conflict. There were like some that did form alliances, especially when it comes to like native tribes that had been in conflict. Some of them would form an alliance with Europeans, like the French. But for the most part, not super besties. Lots of misunderstandings about culture, lots of misunderstandings about, you know, religion and different aspects of society, conflicts over land, over resources, and just different, you know, different values. The Columbian Exchange changed literally everything for everyone in the entire world. It's like one of the most important turning points in history that ever happened. And the big thing about the Columbian Exchange to remember, that if you were in world history last year, you remember more food is always more people, right? If there's more food, the population increases. So almost everywhere in the world, the population increased like pretty dramatically after the Columbian Exchange, with the exception of the Americas, because disease, right? More food equals more people, except when disease gets you first. All right. And then lastly, as I mentioned, native populations decreased. So Europeans turned to Africa for a new labor source. All right, definitely getting lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to turn those questions to you guys too. So if you can go into the questions and ask and answer some of the questions that are there, if you know any of those, it's really helpful for me, for you guys to sort of help and answer those, because I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, even though I'm going to try. I'm going to try. And so let's see. Yeah, so a lot of these questions too, I am going to be talking about. So even though I'm not like specifically talking about it right now. All right, so that's period 1. That's literally all you have to know about period 1. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't spend any more time on it. All right, period 2. This is not the right years on period 2. I'm like, this is Revolutionary War. This is not Revolutionary War. This is 1607 to 1754. Quick note on years. You do not need to memorize years for any of the histories, honestly. I think more so for US and Euro than world, but I think you can do perfectly fine on any of these AP exams without remembering the years. As long as you know the cause and effect, right? Know the order of events, but you don't necessarily need to know the exact years. But period 2 is colonial time, right? So this is like the in-between of the Columbian Exchange and the American Revolution. All right, so you have Europeans from different places, Spanish, Dutch, French, British, and they all have different goals that then shape their colonies, right? And shapes how they are interacting with American Indians. And so, for example, you have, the Dutch and the French that want to work with, they're all about trade. So they're forming alliances and trade partnerships with Native Americans, whereas the British are just like, move aside, this is our land now. So because there's different goals here, there's conflict across the board, which is leading to because of competition for resources, you have competition and conflict between Europeans, and then also between Europeans and American Indians, and then of course between between native tribes as well, because there's still not all natives are the same, right? There's still conflicts between tribes. The colonies themselves were also different, right? So you've got the Northeast, like New England, which is more Puritan, small towns, a lot of agriculture, right? Like kind of family farms. You've got the middle colonies, which is all about cash crops and has like religious tolerance. And then the South is your like big plantations, right? This is where their slave labor is becoming a big part of their culture. All right, so I'm going to finish up on, whoops, that's the wrong tab. Finish up on period 2, and then I'm going to answer any questions there are about period 1 and 2. So go in and ask your questions about period 1 and 2, and help me answer them too. All right, so in period 2, this is when the African slave trade grows most extensively, mostly, because of triangular trade. This is the trade routes from, Europe to Africa to the Americas, back to Europe, kind of going in this triangle, moving slaves, but also goods from the Americas back to Europe, which is leading to population growth. Okay. England's primary reason for the colonies was to get raw materials from them. The colonists didn't super love that, although the fact that this was like the time of like salutary neglect was something that they did like, but they didn't like this, that nobody likes to be colonized, right? So you have early examples of like colonial resentment and like colonial like rebellion protests in different ways. So like Bacon's Rebellion, like the Great Awakening, like ways where American culture was becoming more and more distinct, right? It's influenced by Britain, but it's becoming more and more distinct. All right, let's see. Differences between, so does the pause button work? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you can pause me. Can't pause me in real life. Oh, you guys are doing an awesome job answering these questions. I'm loving this. Okay, so these ones are not for this time periods. We will get to these. We will get there. Okay. All right, so I'll get to these other ones. Here, what were the colonies in the middle colonies? They included like Pennsylvania, Maryland, I'm like blanking on maps. It's basically just like the middle, right? Like you have north, middle, south. So if you kind of look at a map. Let's see. To what extent did Puritan beliefs, oh, Virginia, thank you. To what extent did Puritan beliefs affect the society? A lot. It's still, I mean, you can still see effects of like Puritan ideologies in New England. You know, you have like, it affects like politics, it affects, you know, economics, because the Puritans were like so intense in their belief system and so like rigid in what they could and could not do. Okay. All right. This question here, what's the difference between the Enlightenment and the Great Awakenings? The Enlightenment is much more about like about using science and reasoning to understand society, to understand politics, economics, culture. Whereas the Great Awakenings were much more about like a resurgence of religion. So they're almost like complete opposites, right? Because they're the Enlightenment thinkers almost, they were kind of moving away, not from religion, but from somewhere like the like really intense religions. They were more like deists, which was like they would like believe in a god, but not necessarily, but they'd also believe in science. Whereas the Great Awakenings was really much more like about just a complete resurgence of like religious fervor. All right. All right, we're going to move forward from period 1 and 2. I'm going to loop back through all of them after, and we'll kind of go through a little bit too about like what could be asked about it. Although actually, I think it would have been better if I had just put some of these. Oh, these are by century. All right, it's fine. Here I am just like editing as we go. It's fine. We'll just kind of cut through them. We're just looking at big takeaways here. You know, some of the questions that you guys have about like, you know, really specific things. Like I'm not going to spend too long on like talking about like key terms, things that you can kind of just look up, because I want to spend more time talking about some of the like big picture stuff and how to approach it. So period 3 takeaway. So moving forward to the American Revolution. The big thing to remember is like, you know, what leads to the American Revolution? You have the French and Indian War, which leads to massive debt for Britain. So they start to back away from expansion, right? You have like the proclamation of 1763, and then you also have increased taxes, and the colonists are hating on the new taxes because they're not having any representation in that, right? So they didn't have a part in this, and now they're having to pay more because the British are in debt. And so that is directly like triggering the colonists to call for resistance and demanding representation. And so there's now new experiments with like democracy and government, right? If you don't want a government that's ruled strongly by one king, what does the government look like? And this is really the first time in history that this democratic experiment gets played out. So notice that like in my big takeaways here, I basically skipped the American Revolution. You do not need to know the battles. Do not waste your time studying battles this week. Like know the causes of the revolution and then know the effects. And that's honestly about it. You know, of course, like knowing the different acts, knowing that some of the different key terms are super useful in terms of like writing an LEQ, you know, putting in evidence. But you know, at this point, it's just like really understand the big picture and you're going to be okay. So in their experiment of new government, the first shot is the Articles of Confederation, which was weak. It really didn't, you know, it didn't really look at exactly, it didn't have like a strong federal government. So you couldn't necessarily, you know, raise an army. You couldn't, what were some of the other things? Maybe put them in the chat. What are some of the other reasons why the Articles of Confederation was weak? Some of you guys are saying Shays Rebellion, right? So like reasons why like Articles of Confederation was just like not going to cut it. You couldn't raise taxes, right? It's like they swung from, we hate taxes, leave us alone, to, oh wait, I think we actually kind of needed that a little bit, right? Unstable government, not strong. Good. So starting to have debates about how to do better. Some of those debates were like the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were like Hamilton, wanting more power for the federal government. The Anti-Federalists were more like Jefferson, more power for the states, right? So there's a lot of like struggle over how are we going to design this government? Who's going to have the most power in this? American foreign policy in the beginning, Washington's farewell address was like a big warning against really just like getting involved in foreign affairs, right? So for Washington, he's like, first of all, stay away from political parties. Also stay away from, other foreign issues that are going to rope you in and get you kind of stuck in there. Obviously, we don't really listen to him on either accounts. Although we do kind of stay out of foreign affairs for quite a while. Not until like 20th century where we really come back in. But it was really more about like diplomatic initiatives, right? So like if we have to get involved, we will, but only in a sense to like kind of keep things at bay. In this time period, there's also a lot of migrations happening, migrations within the country, right? Especially like starting to move west more and more, and also like migrations coming into the country. As after the revolution, people are coming through. And so all of these migrations are fueling ethnic tensions, right? Anytime you have a movement of people, you're going to have conflicts between them because of, differences in cultures and traditions. Also just like competition over land and resources, especially as it relates to, not colonists anymore, Americans moving west and Native Americans losing their land because of that. Awesome. Period 3, check. All right, let me give you a quick. You guys are killing it right now. How can we rewatch this tomorrow? It will be right here right in this exact same spot. How are we doing? Are we good? Is this super helpful still? I'm moving quickly because I'm also going to go back through all the units again and give you a sense of like how you might be like assessed on all of them. What kinds of questions might you see? So just want to do a quick check-in and make sure everyone's all right. Still getting lots of questions, more times for notes. This is super helpful. Awesome. All right. So I know I'm moving fast, but you'll have the replay so you can jump back through it as well. And I'm also like really trying to simplify things because I'm not trying to like kill you with content right now because that would be just too much. Learned more in 20 minutes than I did in a month. File print that, put that on our website. All right. So a bit more time for notes. Yeah. I mean, all right. So I'll try to slow down a little bit. And especially now, like I kind of want to go through the beginning parts fast because you can get bogged down. Okay. Like the big ideas first. Cool. All right. So let's keep going. Period 4. All right. So now there's a country. Now we have, independent country. We have a constitution. The things are there. The pieces are there. And like, now what, right? So now you have an expansion of all of those pieces and really like experimenting with it. So the US is going to continue to develop its own ideals, right? So they're taking from the Enlightenment. They're borrowing from other thinkers who had sort of, written down ideas of what this kind of government could look like. But when you actually put it into practice, it gets a lot more complicated. So there's a lot of debates in this time period around what is the role of the federal government? How strong should the government be? How do we make laws and change them? Lots of different like pieces of this that will shift over time. And so because you have different debates, you're going to have different political parties. The other reason why political parties really do rise in this time period has to do with there are just more people voting. So by this time period, the vote is extended to all males, all white males, right? So rather than just having property, any white males could vote. And so there's just now more people voting, which means there's more divisions in how they think. And so all the different political parties are forming. You could put them in the chat. What are some of those political parties? You have, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but once that sort of ends, then you've got Democratic Republicans. Yeah, right. The Anti-Federalists weren't a political party. It was just sort of a group that didn't think that the government should have as much power. But that's sort of the beginnings of what political parties might look like, right? And then the Federalists win that. And so then it's the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans. And then you have the Whigs that come through. Yeah, you've got a bunch of different ones. The Know Nothings, the Jacksonian Democrats, the Free Soil Party. I mean, Free Soil, I guess, a little bit later. There's a bunch of different political parties. So the U.S. Supreme Court is also gaining power in this time period, right? It's established through the Constitution, but the fact that it's now it's starting to rule, right? You even have judicial review, right? So even just the Supreme Court saying this is where we have power to review the different things that happen, the different laws that are passed, and so which it really checks and balances. Spelled wrong. Anyway, so basically the principle around the federal laws are stronger than the state laws. The federal government has authority over the states. This is a big principle. And then Marbury versus Madison. Some of you guys were asking about which Supreme Court cases to know. Marbury versus Madison is definitely one, right? This is where this SC is Supreme Court. This is where they established judicial review. This means that they have the power to look at the laws that are passed, that the legislative branches are passing. Okay, so this is also one other theme you'll see throughout the entirety of U.S. history is a developing national culture. What does it mean to be American? And even just the fact that as Americans, we go into the world and we call ourselves Americans. You don't call yourself, a Massachusettsian, right? And I guess New Yorkers definitely do that. Some people do, but for the most part, you relate to the country, and then when you're in the country, you relate to your region and to your state. But in this time period, Americans are developing a national culture, especially after the War of 1812, which is where we get our national anthem. And you're also starting to get different religious and social reform groups emerging. So temperance, abolition, suffrage, right? And it all kind of plays into the same bullet points up top, right? We're asking these big questions about how do we develop a government that is American, that is good for all Americans? And so as, white men are answering that question, women are what about us, right? Slaves, what about us? And so that just keeps happening. And so all three of those groups will come up, obviously more, especially in the next unit, the next time period. Let's see, unless you're a Texan. Yeah, Texans definitely say they definitely identify as Texans, New Yorkers. But for the most part, you still, you travel in the world, you don't say you're a Texan first, usually. Unless you're really gung-ho. Okay, this is the first industrial revolution in the United States. Right, so what happened in Britain right before this, the Industrial Revolution is now spreading. This is what is also referred to as the Market Revolution. So you have a complete change in industry where, instead of things being built by hand, they're now using machines. You have things like the cotton gin, the factory system, the expansion of railroads. We're not quite linking, the country yet, but we're expanding the number of railroads that we have. Just completely industrializing, which is shifting everything, right? Everything you remember about industrialization from world, same things apply here. It's just in America. And then just westward expansion is also increasing our role in foreign trade, right? Because we're growing as a country, we're producing more goods because of industrialization. And so because of this, we sort of have to define what foreign policy looks like more so than we did before, right? Before, we may have been able to say, we'll stay out of it, but it's getting a little harder to do that. And so, for example, the Monroe Doctrine is where Monroe is like, okay, Europe, you worry about you, we'll handle the Americas. And that kind of stays in place for quite a while, where it keeps the Europeans out of the affairs in America. And then and vice versa, right? We sort of stay out of the affairs of Europe until World War I, really. I think there's like 2 more things here. Okay. All right. So then you have, as we're expanding, we're bringing more states into the Union, into the country. And so the tensions over slavery are increasing, because it's like, as you're bringing in new states, now we have to figure out, is this going to be a free state or a slave state? And trying to keep that balance means that you have to add 2 states every time. So what happens when you just want to add 1? It's going to be, confusing. So the Missouri Compromise is like kind of what settled things at first, where it drew a line at 3630. Everything north will be free. Everything south will be a slave state. This is how, and that like lasted for a couple decades until Kansas-Nebraska Act reverses it, basically. Can I explain the Monroe Doctrine again? Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine is essentially like it just kind of draws a line in the Atlantic. And it says, like, in terms of foreign policy, the United States will be concerned with the Americas, and Europe will be concerned with Europe. And we're going to kind of stay out of each other's way. That's like in its most basic level. Can I talk about the War of 1812? I mean, it's not that. I mean, it's essentially like American Revolution 2.0, except everyone's like angrier and it's not as like, I don't know, patriotic, until they win. And then it was like a whole big party. Yeah, so you got this. Dope. All right, you guys are doing awesome in the chat right now. Keep doing your thing. All right, so that's period 4. Okay, before I get into period 5, let me check out some questions. Oh man, there's lots of questions. All right, we'll come back in here. Definitely go through the questions when you get a chance, and comment on them. Especially if there's anyone here that has taken APUSH before. All right, let me go back through. All right, we'll get to that one. We'll get to that one. Get to this one. Yeah. Great Britain refused to leave us alone, and they got upset, and they fought about it. Yeah, the War of 1812 is just like, meh. But Jackson does rise in power, and we get our, national anthem. This question, like, what are the main stances of early political parties and how do they change into the 1800s? They're mostly around the role of the federal government, in terms of like how powerful should government be versus the state governments. And it all kind of boils down to differences in opinions about slavery too. Although most of the political parties at this time would have been like pro-slavery, it's still around like how strong should the federal government be? And honestly, I mean, I would even argue, and like obviously this can get way more nuanced, but it kind of feels like most political parties in American history are around that exact same question. How strong should the federal government be, and what power should they have, and what should they be involved in? Should the federal government have anything to do with our economy, with our society, with people? Should the federal government help me pay my student loans, or is that on to me to pay? You can like see differences in our political parties today that are around the same lines. Yeah, that one was kind of what I answered. All right. Cool. All right. Going into That's funny. Going into period 5. All right, so period 5 is Civil War, right? This is the Civil War time. But notice that I'm going to barely talk about the actual war because, again, forget the wars, right? Just know the causes and the effects, and that's how you should study for this test. If you're in college and you're taking a class about the Civil War, obviously you're going to need to know more, and there's plenty to know, but you don't need to know the battles. Okay, so in this time period, this is like the most expansion that's really happening because by the end of this unit, this period, America has already kind of the frontier closes, right? We've reached the coast. We have all over this land. The country is like built. Everything has been discovered, and so this is the like big time for Western expansion. All built on this idea of manifest destiny, that it is the destiny of Americans to conquer, to expand to all the land from coast to coast. No matter what that means for anyone that's already living there. So some things that led to the Civil War. So the Civil War is about slavery, right? There is no way around that. That is the cause of the Civil War. The things that are leading to it, I mean, it was decades, like all the way back to actually just like drafting the Constitution. You have plenty of debates over slavery, and they just kept putting the issue off further and further and further. So was the Civil War inevitable? Kind of, right? And so you have some attempts to like solve the slavery issue, but none of them are solving the slavery issue because none of them are abolishing slavery. And so you have like the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott case, which are, attempting to solve the slavery issue by arguing that slaves are not citizens and therefore don't have rights. Therefore, this is a non-issue. But that's not going to solve anything. So we keep debating about slavery until finally Lincoln wins in 1860. That's the immediate cause of secession. You have the South that, leaves the Union, and then you have Civil War. All right, so the Civil War itself lasts for 4 years, and then it's over. And so just like, see how we kind of, yeah, okay, so if your teacher is saying that it's not about slavery and it's about states and versus federal rights, but like what are they actually arguing about? The states want the right to continue to have slaves, whether or not the federal government says they should or shouldn't, right? And so even if you're arguing that the Civil War is about the difference between the federal government and states government, it's about slavery. Yeah, exactly. So like this is not, it's not really like, there's no way around it. Every single other thing you can say the Civil War is about, you can bring it back to slavery. Are there other tensions that may be happening? Sure. But ultimately, Civil War doesn't actually pop off unless there's slavery. What was the whole thing about the secession of the South? Yeah, so Lincoln wins, and the South is just like, we're not going to be a part of that. And so South Carolina is the first one to secede. The rest of them go after that, and now you have war. And it's not even like the war itself. The like, it wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation that it really became about, like, literally about slavery, that Lincoln sort of had to choose a side in that, because Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He's just like a kind of wants, he wants to maintain the Union, and if that means that slavery exists, then it can exist as long as there are free places as well. But the Emancipation Proclamation is a really smart, like, tactical move on his part, because it keeps Europe out of it. Otherwise, Europe could have gotten involved, and on the side of the South, because they had a big part in cotton, right? So the cotton industry was huge, and the South was the biggest, like, exporter of cotton. But as soon as Lincoln clearly says that I'm going to, free the slaves, therefore the Union is fighting on the side of abolition, that means that Europe can't really get involved. It makes it a lot more tricky for them to get involved. Let's see. Right. So, and then, yeah, okay. So the North wins the Civil War because of a couple of like key advantages. They've got a better military strategy, right? The Anaconda Plan, they really like wrap the South and cut them off from supplies, from resources, and then attack the capital. They have more people. They have a larger population. Partially, this is because of industrialization. And so the cities of the North had been attracting more people for decades. Lots more people were moving there. And the infrastructure, so just industrialization in general. They've got more factories, more like just a lot more ability to mobilize and create a lot more resources, food, weapons, all the different things that you need to win a war. And so that's why the North wins. And then you have the end of slavery in 1865. Really, the end of the Civil War is the end of slavery, although the Emancipation Proclamation officially, frees the slaves. They're not actually, free in the South until the end of slavery. And the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. So, but even then, it's not really slavery totally ended, which I guess I'll spill more tea later. Okay. All right. So after the Civil War, you have Reconstruction. So these are your big amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th. I would remember the differences between them because if it comes up in a question, it's just worth remembering. 13th abolishes slavery. 14th gives citizenship. 15th is voting. Kind of goes in that order, right? So first you're free, then you become a citizen, then you can vote. Let's see. Yeah, someone asked if you had to know a battle. You don't know you just don't have to know any battles. You just don't. Know that this is happening. Know the root of what's going on. Other things that, because of those 3 amendments, also during Reconstruction, let's see. Nope. You have more, you have the first Black Americans who are voted into office. You have, movements of communities from the South out of the South that start to kind of move out. But these things are not going to solve everything. Now, it officially ends in 1877 because it gives Hayes the presidency and they remove the troops from the South. And it really doesn't solve everything. It leaves a lot of room for continued voter suppression, right? Like the poll tax, the grandfather clause, the literacy test, other ways that we still see today of people not being able to vote, even though they have a right to vote. You have a rise of violence with the KKK, with Jim Crow laws. Ending slavery just kind of shifts people's way of doing things. Sharecropping, right, keeps people on the same land that they worked on as slaves. Now they might get paid a very tiny amount, but they don't have enough to move. So what's the difference, right? If I can't leave because I don't have enough money to leave, it's a continuation of it. So if you want to think of a continuity here, that's one. Doesn't solve everything. All right, period 6. Yeah, we'll go tea. Spilling all kinds of tea here. Black codes. Tuesday. This is Tuesday's tea. I'm out here just explaining the root causes of the Civil War. I'm you can't convince me that I'm wrong in these. All right, period 6. We're doing so good on time, y'all. We're gonna finish all of this. We're gonna cut through all of the big factors, and then we're still gonna have 40-ish minutes to go through now how are you going to be assessed on all of these things. So we're doing really good, and I know that all those questions are piling up. We will make sure we get to them, and if I don't answer them live, I'll go through the list after and make sure that those are answered. So All right, period 6 is really, this is the Gilded Age. This is the era of big business. Now you have industrialization already happened, but now you have like a further industrialization, right? This is the second industrial revolution. This has to do more with like electricity, chemical, like power, I don't know. And so these big business models are leading to monopolies and corruption, political corruption. We hadn't really set up our government to prevent from these things, because how could you know that they were going to happen? So 3 people to know would be like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. You have your like horizontal integration, where it's owning everything within one step of the process. Within one industry, kind of like owning all the different companies within one industry. Vertical integration would be owning all the steps of the process from like extracting raw materials all the way to actually like selling the goods. And you have more aggressive financial methods to actually pay for these things, which are going to lead to some spikes and depressions, recessions. So because of big business, you've got the people are calling for more protection, right? And so the big businesses are taking advantage of people, and the workers start to create these unions, right? Labor unions. The farmers start to use like collective action, right? And these are all powers that like groups of people have. If you bargain collectively, you're more likely to get what you want, whether it's better wages or better working conditions, less working hours. Like think about all the teacher strikes that are happening now, right? And one teacher goes and argues for better pay, it's easy to just fire them or say no. But if all the teachers refuse to go to work, they have to listen. So this is the kind of rise of unions. Unions had existed in other parts of the world, but this is sort of the first real big protest we're seeing, calling for more regulation, more protection, better working conditions. Migration is a huge piece of this time period. Huge waves of migrations happening within the country, right? As people are moving to cities, whether they're moving, like African Americans are moving from the South to the North into cities. People from farms are moving into cities. You also just have huge waves of migrations coming from Europe. Before the Civil War too, there's a huge spike that in period 5, period 5, like in the 1850s and 40s, from Ireland, Germany. You have, revolutions and some political turmoil happening in Europe. You have famine in Ireland. So you have huge waves of migrations that kind of paused during the Civil War and then pick back up. Plenty of people are moving for jobs. You also have things like the Homestead Act that is convincing people to move, get a piece of land, come move here, like come from Germany, you'll get a plot of land, you can develop it, you've got it for, it's yours. So huge reasons to move to the US. The Gilded Age itself affects culture. So things like social Darwinism, where, there's this idea that there's literally like people who are superior to others, sort of an extension, right? So it's just kind of like warping Darwin's ideas of evolution in terms of survival of the fittest and applying those to society. And then using those ideas to argue for, slavery or for Jim Crow laws or for imperialism, right? Using social Darwinism, white man's burden, any of those ideas to promote, harming others. You also have gospel of wealth, which is like now all these people that have all this money should be like reinvesting it back into the community. And then, of course, continued debates over citizens' rights. So Plessy versus Ferguson would be another big Supreme Court case to know. This is where it solidifies separate but equal, that you can have two separate schools, 2 separate hospitals, separate institutions, as long as they are of equal value, of equal, support. All right, yeah. Awesome. Yeah, you guys are really killing it in this chat. Appreciate that. What is AA? Yeah, AA is African American. Gilded Age, aka presidents we don't care about. Seriously. You know the presidents, and then you get into this time and you're like, wait, who? Honestly, I would say that period 6, I personally, I find a lot of connection between period 6 and today. Because especially as you go into period 7, it's almost like period 6 is very similar to the last kind of 30 years in terms of big corporations. And now we're sort of in this new progressive wave, just like what happened in the early 1900s, right? Where you have big corporations, you have a lot of money in politics, in all of these things, and then you have people sort of pushing against those things. And so I see a lot of similarities in that, as just sort of a lot of, history repeating itself. Someone asked, what happened with women in the Gilded Age? So women at this point you have the first wave of feminism is happening here. Seneca Falls happened in 1848. So this was kind of the beginning of the first wave of feminism. But you have, push for suffrage. You have women very actively involved in unions, in, working in the different factories, pushing for better rights, right? You have, what is it called? I remember the exact year when this happened. What was the name of the factory that burned down? The shirtwaist factory? Excuse me. Something like that. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where the factory itself burns down, and it's mostly women who are harmed, who are killed in that fire. And so because of that, you have women leading a lot of the movements for better working conditions, because they're the ones who are being taken advantage of almost the most, right? And so so women are a big part of all of these movements. Every single one of them, there is a woman very involved in that movement. And Republican motherhood is earlier. It's more colonial. Cult of domesticity is definitely now. Cult of domesticity is sort of aligned with Victorian values, where it's sort of a woman's place is in the home, getting women to sort of be more domestic rather than working in the factory. But Rose the Riveter is later. So that's a little bit about women in this time period. It's just they're doing the same things, All right, period 7. So listen, period 7 is the biggest percentage of the test. I mean, it's technically lumped in together with the rest of them, but they tell teachers to spend the most time teaching this. So you're most likely to see a lot of questions on this. I mean, we've got world wars, we've got progressivism, we've got the Great Depression, lots of stuff. So the US is continuing to transition from agriculture to industrial economy. Keep in mind, it doesn't mean that agriculture stops. We very much rely on agriculture today. We just don't do it by hand, and we don't each do it on our own. There are big farms in, the Midwest, across the plains, that produce a whole lot of agriculture that we eat every day, but we're not really part of it. And they don't have to have a lot of people part of it, because there's big machines. And so because there's big machines, because you don't all have to be farmers, people start to move more and more from rural to urban. Lots of opportunities for jobs in the cities, but the Great Depression is a major setback, right? Where you have, things are going really, really, really well, and then it just totally tanks. So you have mass unemployment and a real setback just in innovation. You can't really innovate when you're hungry. You need to have your like basic needs met first. And so it's kind of a big pause in all of the like in all of that transition. So just like we saw with, we had the big businesses, we had the Gilded Age, and like just like I kind of said before, the progressives are going to respond to that, calling for more government action, calling for women's suffrage, right? Calling for prohibition, and calling for the government to step in and end corruption and inequality. Different aspects of like society that we see that are unstable or unequal. And so there's a lot of push for changes, and a lot of these things happen, right? So you have the 19th Amendment, you have, the 18th Amendment with prohibition, you have, what else? You have some of the like, I guess some of the antitrust acts happened before, but now you have the like the ways that they make them stronger. You have voting for senators directly rather than the like state governments choosing them. That really opens things up. It's all about like giving people more say in what's happening so that they can fight for the things they want. This is also the first time where we really see like mass media. And so, before this, you have like things that the whole country might experience, but it takes a long time for like messages to travel. And so because of like the radio, now everybody can experience something together. So, things like music that they can experience together, like the War of the Worlds, debacle, like fireside chats, you think about like how far things are now. Now we are, clearly living in a very mass media world where it's so quick, just think about like everybody's watching Game of Thrones at the same times. This is sort of the beginnings of that, right? Where we're all listening to the same thing. We're all part of the same like mass media. Memes today. There's tons of ways that we are all part of the same culture today. We share those moments. And this is sort of the first times of that. Twitter has just made it even faster, right? So even, I don't have to literally watch it all at the same time on the TV. I don't have to hear about it later tonight, not watching the news. We all experience it like in the moment, everywhere around the world, right? Something happens on one side of the world, everyone knows about it right away. Even like Fiveable, right? Y'all are like here together. All right, so let's see. But there's also like bigger debates over social issues because we're starting to like talk about things more together. So debates around science, like the Scopes trial, religion in terms of like, religion in schools, and gender and race, of course. This is also a very like, this is like one of the most like violent times in U.S. history to be Black in America. This time period, I think we think of like the Civil War and slavery, and then slavery ends, and then then civil rights happened. But like this time period here is like when the most lynchings happened, when the most attacks on Black communities happened, police brutality. Like this is like huge, and so this is not getting any better. And it's not until like the world wars where we're really like kind of pushed into then the civil rights movement in the 60s. Changes in migration because we are starting to restrict it. And so in the 20s, there is the Quota Act that restricts, immigration from certain places after a certain amount. In that Quota Act, what they did is they used the census of 1890. And so in 1924, there's a whole different group of people coming into the country. And for example, you have like in 1890, the Chinese Exclusion Act was preventing Chinese immigrants. And so in 1924, they used those numbers from the census to then decide what the quota should look like for immigration, which meant that it wasn't really reflective of who was actually moving around. And heavily favored immigrants from Western Europe. But there's also a lot of just like mass movements of people into the North, into the West, right? After the Great Depression, you've got people going from, Oklahoma to California, African Americans going from the South to northern cities like Chicago, Baltimore, New York, out to the West, Oakland, Los Angeles. These are lots and lots of movement. After the Great Depression, the New Deal does not solve the Great Depression. It's not that isn't the it, but it does help define what modern liberalism will look like, how our government could be involved in, the economy, in people's livelihoods, right? What does a welfare state in America look like, which had been already established in Germany, in Great Britain. And so this is where it starts to happen in the United States. And then, of course, politically, you have imperialism at the beginning. You have the Spanish-American War. You have, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico becoming essentially American colonies. And then you have World War I and World War II, which really takes the U.S. from isolationists to interventionists, right? They go from, we're not part of it, that's not our war, we're going to stay out of it, to we're actually going to go get involved in everything to make sure that communism doesn't spread. And so, since World War II, the U.S. has been involved in just like all of it. Before World War II, the U.S. really stayed out of it. World War II is the thing that ended the Great Depression because of mass mobilization. Let's see. What happened in Guam and Puerto Rico? Both became colonies of the United States. And Guam, Puerto Rico, and I forget what else I had said. Yeah, after the Spanish-American War, they're just like basically taken from it. I mean, that whole war was like, we're going to help you liberate you from Spain. And then it was like, actually, we're going to annex you and make you part of America. And now they're still part of America, but not really part of America because they can't vote and they can't be Hawaii is the other one. So Hawaii is the one that becomes a state, but the other ones don't have statehood, but they are under, like Puerto Rico is part of America in every sense of it, but it's not a state, so it doesn't have some of the same rights. Yeah, here we go. We're chanting in here. All right, so that's period 7. Whole lot going on in period 7. And we'll loop back in a few minutes when we talk about some of the big changes and stuff. Period 8. Period 8, you have the U.S. as a global leader, right? Now the United States is a superpower. After World War II, all of Europe is like completely devastated, and so you don't have much competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so those Cold War tensions are leading to really increasing the fear of communism and forcing the U.S. to kind of get involved in other wars to prevent the spread of communism. It's all about containment. So by proxy wars, I mean Korea, Vietnam, those are like the two big ones where the U.S. is involved and so is Russia. And it's like they're fighting each other, but they're not, right? They're doing it through these other countries to, prevent the spread of communism. And so both Korea and Vietnam are very similar. It's even like the North is fighting for communism. The South is fighting for democracy. The difference is really the like support in the U.S. So, you have Korea where there is a fair amount of like domestic support for Korea. Right after World War II, it sort of made sense. In Vietnam, maybe at first, okay, yeah, this makes sense. We'll like support it, but then it sort of trails off and becomes this whole big anti-war movement. There is definitely, yeah. So like in the 50s and the early 60s, there's support for anti-communist policy. It makes sense, right? Like we don't want the Soviet Union to expand and to gain more power and more places, and then it doesn't make sense anymore, because then it's like, well, now we're sending all these troops out and, to Vietnam, and for what, right? We don't have a clear goal. We're not even sure why we're there in the first place. How did we get involved? The U.S. actually got involved in Vietnam during Eisenhower's presidency in the 50s, and then it kind of increases. Like JFK is literally increasing the number of troops in Vietnam, but we don't think of JFK as part of it, because it's LBJ that uses this like Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where they basically said that this ship was attacked, which it turns out it wasn't, and they use that to increase their troops. And so there's just a lot of questions around like how much power should the president have when it comes to war. And so the War Powers Act is passed to prevent that, to make it so that the Congress has to allow for war to actually happen, that the president can't just do it on their own. And actually, this is coming up right now, where this debates around Yemen is happening right now. And it's all about the War Powers Act. How much power does the president have? Yeah, so a couple questions about the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is basically, you have at the end of World War I, it's like you have, this need to sort of like punish Germany, right? To punish the belligerence of World War I. And that clearly didn't work, because then World War II happens. What you end up doing is pissing people off. And so then you have the Nazis, then you have World War II. And so after World War II, the difference is the Marshall Plan. So rather than, punishing Germany, we're actually going to go help them. We're going to put a lot of money into Germany. We're going to rebuild this economy. We're going to make sure that people have what they need so that they can establish themselves as a strong state, a democratic state, and they can be a strong trade partner, right? So the Marshall Plan puts a ton of money into Western Europe, and it really rebuilds and completely revitalizes it, and is maybe one of the best things that America did maybe ever, right? Because now you have a pretty stable, relatively stable international society because of this, because you have a lot of countries that are kind of on that side. All right, so in the 50s and 60s, you have civil rights movement for racial progress, and so you have really this process of gaining rights through nonviolent protests, through direct actions like boycotts, like sit-ins, and then also really using law. And using the law is the biggest difference here, because there were nonviolent protests and direct actions before. But what makes this civil rights movement stick is the use of laws, because of Brown versus Board is the first example of that. The NAACP starts to look for cases to try and to bring to, they want to get it to the Supreme Court so that they can get a law on the books that is going to end Jim Crow, right? And so Brown versus Board is the first one to do that, to end segregation of schools. And then, obviously you have others like Martin Luther King, like John Lewis, Rosa Parks, people who are fighting for equality. And then it's moving slowly though, right? It's slow progress and high resistance. There's a lot of resistance to it. And because it's slow progress, plenty of people don't think it's moving fast enough. And so you have, a break in the movement towards, we need to arm ourselves. We need to push for faster action. This is the Black Panthers. This is, Malcolm X, just pushing for more. All right. Some of the other social movements are really inspired by the civil rights movement, right? We see the civil rights movement happening. And so other movements happen in like the sexual revolution, second wave of feminism, really women pushing for more equality in the workplace, more autonomy over their bodies, over decisions they're making at home, whether or not, getting divorced, getting lines of credit, just having more like freedoms in public spaces, essentially. Movements about the environment, people like Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring, and economic equality, right? We have like class and the Great Society, right? Pushing for more support for like people who are poor, and then counterculture, Woodstock, and yeah, of course, gay rights movement, right, which is really kicked off in Stonewall because of Marsha P. Johnson, who I wish was going to be on your test because she's like the dopest person in U.S. history, but she's not going to be on your test because this test was not about her, unfortunately. And all right. 60s are really about liberalism. You have the Great Society. You have just like more, it's kind of an extension of the New Deal, right? It's like, how do we have the government supporting people in different groups, different ways? You have the like education reform, you have welfare reform, healthcare reform, Medicare, Medicaid, and all of those things will then be challenged by conservatives. And in the 70s, it's much more about like a distrust with the government, and challenging all those things, all of these people, all these movements. You have people pushing back. Every time there's change happening, there's always a counter movement to that. Every time, no matter what the change is about, there's always pushback, right? And so, and really what the words liberal and conservative mean. Liberal is about change, and conservatism is about keeping things the way they are. So in the 70s, Watergate, Vietnam, both of these things are leading to like massive distrust with the government. All right, really quick, finishing up. Period 9 is like really fast. It's only going to be a tiny bit of your test too. Don't spend too long studying period 9. So Reagan is conservative, extremely conservative, right? Reaganomics, all about tax cuts and less government, right? We don't want government in a part of people's lives. It's literally like, it swings one way during the Great Society and like New Deal, and it swings the total other way under Reagan. Cold War ends because the U.S. just spends more money than the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union like really goes into a lot of debt because of Afghanistan, and people start to get frustrated by that. And so this leads to changes in the Soviet Union, and that eventually collapses it. So Cold War is over. Maybe. Is the Cold War over? Who knows? But it's like officially done then. Advances in science and technology, right? Obviously like digital technology, the internet, completely new era of globalization. We've moved so fast in our like progress of technology that it's totally disrupted just like how we interact. All right, demographic shifts in our entire society. We have, a new wave of immigration, mostly coming from Latin America, from Asia, Southeast Asia, from Africa. And so this is completely changing demographics, right? In terms of race and gender and family structures, diversity, and all of those things lead to debates because people don't have rights and people want rights. And then this is okay. So conflict in the Middle East, especially, so 9/11 is basically the last thing that comes up in APUSH, but you're not even going to, 9/11 shouldn't come up on your test. It's like it's sort of like, we don't really know, we're too close to 9/11 to really know what the like historical impact of it is. We can look at the 2000s, but it's still a part of our foreign policy. It's still kind of, we're still in that story. So you're not going to even get questions on that. You probably won't even get questions of like the 90s really. Like I would say like Clinton would definitely be the last president on APUSH test, but even then, like it'll be very, very small. 9/11 was on your mock exam. Yeah, I mean, maybe it'll appear, but I just think we're just too close. We can't analyze it in the way that we can analyze the past before that. Whew, we made it. All right, let's take a deep breath. 9/11 was on the test 2013, 2014. I mean, maybe. But that test was also really different then. 1980 was 40 years ago. Yeah, I know. We're all getting old. All right, so let's see. All right, let me go through some questions. These are, you guys are really killing it answering these questions. All right, space race. Okay, let me put up a quick poll. Would you rather Q&A or go back through the periods or CCOT/comparisons/ cause and effect? Boom. Quick poll. And we have like at least another hour. So I can spend time answering your questions. Oh man, you guys aren't even, you're like Q&A, that's dumb. Look at that. That's awesome. All right, well then it's done. Then clearly that's what I'll do. Only 25 of you had voted. There are so many of you guys in here. There's over 100 of you guys in here. All right, so I'll go back through all the time periods. So we'll go back through all of it one more time, pointing out, I'm basically gonna go by century, pointing out more big trends, like how you might get asked things. Q&A, what I'll do, so we have 2 more sessions happening tomorrow night and the night after that you guys all have access to. And I'll probably even add another session too and do more Q&A. So we'll come back through it. And you guys are doing a really great job of answering these questions in here. So type whatever questions you have, definitely type them in. Be really specific with them, like rather than like, how should I study? Like ask a really good question and we'll go through and answer them and we'll make sure that you have, answers to those. Can you answer a few of the top voted questions? Yeah, I could probably do that. Can you explain new conservatism in the late 1900s? Yeah, so I mean, it's really it's a shift from, from the New Deal and the Great Society and these new questions around like how government can have a role in supporting people. And those get tested through those presidencies, through mostly FDR, JFK, and LBJ, right? Through those like acronym presidents. And then you have, and then it kind of like swings the other way, right? And so the new conservatives are much more about like smaller government, family values, right? There's sort of that, like some people were talking about, like, it's like response to the counterculture, response to the sexual revolution, right? So it's like, how could you do those things? Like, those are so like not biblical. I don't know. I guess I'm not really. And that's sort of that's kind of the like push against that. Other things in here, all trends are reactionary. Yeah, so it's really just a push against that. All right. Oh man, that's awesome. Thank you, Brendan, for adding that. I'm gonna leave this question, this one that says, what are some of the most important acts to know in APUSH? Has a link to a Quizlet deck there. That's awesome. We'll tweet that out too. And Goldwater appears sometimes in the DBQ. Yeah, Goldwater was the conservative running for president in 1964. So he's like running against Johnson in that election, and he's sort of the like first of the conservatives, right? And he's getting a lot of momentum, like he almost wins, but doesn't win. And then it's Nixon that sort of picks up where he left off. All right, so let's go back in time. to the 16th century. We won't spend too long on these early centuries, but we're going to go all the way back in time, back to the beginning of U.S. history. And what I'm going to do, so basically for each century, I have a slide on causation, on change over time, and then on comparisons. Like what kinds of things could you be asked about? So in terms of the 16th century, so the 1500s, you could be asked about, European exploration, right? So like causes, gold, God, glory, right? Those are the three like motivations for exploration. The effects of it would be the decrease of the native population, the increase of European population, and then conflicts. So, if you have any, and remember, like the essays that you get now, they're not going to say like, they're not going to say specifically this is a causation essay. And you can even approach, even if it says like how something changed, how it was like altered, you could even write that whole essay as a causation essay. You could even write it as a comparison essay. They've really changed the rubric so that it doesn't really matter which one you're in. But I think this is useful to sort of just look at the content through the lens of the AP exam, right? Like what kinds of things come up, because this is sort of it. Columbian exchange, why does the Columbian exchange happen? Mercantilism, right? You're looking for a better way to trade, right? We're just, at this point, Europe had sort of fallen behind China, mostly China, and mostly China. And so they're trying to catch up, right? And so we need to have more trade. And so let's go, west. And also gold, God, glory. Some of the effects of the Columbian exchange: more crops equals more food, which means more people, spread of disease, coerced labor. Someone asked before, what is the encomienda system? It's basically like a coerced labor system where mostly natives were enslaved in this. And what they would do is it was like slavery, only not as harsh as chattel slavery. And it was almost like in exchange for like education or like language training. So it wasn't just like, chattel slavery is like the most intense version of coerced labor. Okay. Colonial exchange LEQ last year. Yeah, right. All right. I need to like make this screen a little smaller. Okay. All right. Comparisons in the 16th century. Really, like the only thing that would come up would be like comparing Native American tribes, because remember they're all different. But this won't be like a whole essay topic. Like, don't worry about that. But it could come up in maybe like a multiple choice question. So just remember that like the Native American tribes are regionally different because of the ways they adapt to their environment. So Pacific Northwest is like fishing, right? And wood shelters. The Northeast is like wigwams, longhouses, farming, hunting. Great Plains is all nomadic. They're following the buffalo. And then the Southwest is all about like farming, like maize. They've got permanent clay shelters. So I have on here just sort of like some of the differences in their like types of houses, and in what they ate. And you can definitely tell that like, why are these different? It's because the regions are different, right? Fishing in the Pacific Northwest makes sense because you're on the sea. Following the buffaloes in the Great Plains makes sense. It's open space. CCOT in the 1500s. So some changes would be demographic. So, more Europeans, death of Native Americans. So demographic changes, new technologies coming from Europe, especially in terms of like navigation. Some of the continuities of this time period would be exploitation of Native Americans, which is a continuity in most of the time periods. And that's the 1500s. Okay. I still want to like make this a little. Here we go. All right. So 17th century, 1600s. So, one more. Some of the causation topics you could have about, European colonization in this time period. Like, you have the Spanish and the French and the Dutch and the British. Why are they in the Americas? Because they want to increase their trade and money. They want more resources to produce more goods. They want to create more settlements of people, right? You have people like fleeing different like religious persecution. And then the effects of them would be, of course, again, Native American population decreases, Christianity spreads, conflict increases. Salutary neglect. So, just to restate that one, that is where Great Britain just kind of left the colonies alone, right? Like, why leave them alone? It's expensive to govern them. They're physically too far away. And if we get too involved, they might align with the French, right? Which they end up doing. And so those sort of the causes of salutary neglect. Some of the effects are that the colonies are able to develop their own systems. And so they're influenced by Great Britain, but they aren't, they have their own American way of doing things, right? So like the House of Burgesses would be an example of like, it's similar to like the House of Commons, but it's sort of the American version of it. Or like the Maryland like Toleration Act, similar. What else? Some of the like the state like constitutions were kind of similar. Comparisons in the 1600s, this would definitely be around either comparing the European colonizers or the British colonies. So the British, lots of settlers, whole families would come, and they were really pushing back the natives on like land-wise. The French, you have trade alliances, intermarriage, and not really like taking lots of land, just like really more there for the trade purposes. The Dutch, same thing, very similar to the French, took land a little bit less intermarriage than the French. And then the Spanish were more about racial mixing, spreading of Christianity, and really like incorporating the Native Americans, right? Like the encomienda system, incorporating them into their way of life. If you compare the British colonies, you have New England, right, which is Puritan, is more of a mixed economy. There's religious conflict, there's native conflict. You've got the middle colonies, which are more diverse, more tolerant, and lots of farmland. And then the South, which is rural plantation economies, class and race hierarchies. So those are the things that you could compare in the 1600s. I mean, you're not going to get a full essay on any of these things, but you could totally get like a short answer question about one of these things. CCOT in the 1600s changes would include more conflict with Native Americans / settlers, so like Bacon's Rebellion. Less land is available for settlement because there's more settlements happening. So it's not like the whole thing is available and like available, right? Continuities would be like continuation of coerced labor, right? Slavery continues throughout this time period. Indentured servants, encomienda system continues. Did the South have a specific religion? Yeah, the South is like most of like the South is like the biggest branch of Christianity in the United States is Protestantism. And so that would have been one of the biggest one. But in the South, even more specifically, would be like Baptists, which maybe happened later. I'm not sure the exact years that kind of transitions. Chesapeake was middle. Pop culture. All right. All right, 1700s. We're killing it. Actually, you know what's going to be great is I'm probably going to have some time to do a few questions too. All right, so some causation in the 1700s. What could you be asked about? Causes and effects. You should know the causes and effects of the American Revolution, right? So the causes would be the 7 Years' War because of debt, the Enlightenment because we're now thinking about, you know, if my government is not supporting me, then I have the right to overthrow it. And so, what is that? The social contract, and then increased taxation, right? That's more immediate, right? So Stamp Act, Sugar Act, all those. And then the effects of those things, the effects of, I guess these are the effects of colonial resistance. These are like the immediate effects of those things. So you have, you know, the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Tea Party as acts of protest. You have, oops, close message. You have, whoa, why did it get so small? There we go. What happened? Okay, you have Declaration of Independence, and then of course the actual war. Republican motherhood as an effect of the colonial resistance here. The slave trade, because remember, this is in this time period, this is when the slave trade is really expanding quite a bit. Why does the slave trade expand in this time period? Because the native population decreased, and so there's a need for labor, and they looked more to Africa. The effects of the slave trade would be racial segregation, laws that support slavery, and laws that support slavery and support like the continuation of that. Slave culture, right? So even just like syncretic religions like Vodun, where it's like this blending of West African spiritualism and Christianity. So it's sort of like a new religion that comes about as a result of the blending of those two cultures. And triangular trade, right? So like an increasing of triangle trade. Question about the why is the Republican motherhood an effect of colonial resistance? Because it's sort of like, you know, we need to make sure that our children are educated in our systems, right? And so it kind of gives women a place in that. What wars did the African Americans fight in? All of them. The troops are not necessarily like desegregated, right? They're fighting in different armies, but it's all of them. All right. Comparisons in this time period, you could compare the Constitution to the Articles of Confederation. So you've got, you know, the difference in like organization of states in federal government. They both were meant to create a, you know, power over the states. But the Articles of Confederation were weak, didn't have an executive or a judicial branch, and no tax. No federal tax. The Constitution had separation of powers, had an executive and a judicial branch, had powers for military and tax. Did the Articles of Confederation achieve anything? Yeah. I mean, it achieved the fact that there could be a country, right? Creating a government that could oversee the states. So, you know, did it accomplish what it needed to? No, like it was too weak to really be strong in that, but it kind of bridged the gap, right, between the end of the war and the Constitution. It kind of set it up. Yeah. Who desegregated the army? It was Truman with like an executive order. Some changes and continuities in the 1700s. So big changes would just be like American independence, the Constitution, expansion of territory, so the Northwest Ordinance, the First Great Awakening. Let's see. Okay, so those would be some of the big changes. Some of the big continuities would be continued debates around political freedoms and like how strong the federal government should be. Continued conflict with Native Americans, and then just a general lack of rights for slaves and for women. So those would be the two big things. The Northwest Ordinance was what allowed the land in the Northwest to become states and kept them free. Okay. All right, moving forward. I think like if you guys like you have these slides, if you really use these slides to study, you're going to be in a really good spot, because I know that there's obviously a lot of other key terms and things that you can memorize to sort of support all of these things. These are your really big ideas, you know. If you can sort of memorize the big causes and effects, you're going to be fine. Like chances of one of these being the LEQ are high because there's only so many options, right? So, all right. So I think here now I kind of split the centuries. So early 19th century causation, you've got reform, cultural movements. Why? Why do you have a second Great Awakening? Because you have this like resurgence of fundamentalism, because you have industrialism, you know, changes in just like society that really kind of lead to questions around like who has rights to do different things. Do you think it would be useful to memorize these slides? Yeah, I do. I do. Totally do. Yeah, there's like a 10-second lag here, so apologies for that. Effects of those movements would be like the movements themselves grow, and the tensions between different parts of society are also growing. No, session's not over. We're still going. Yeah, feel free to come in and out. This video will be here when you are ready for, if you want to rewatch it, but we're not done. Market revolution. The causes of the market revolution would be new technologies, new methods, better transportation. The effects would be the working class, cult of domesticity, right? The fact that like women should then like work at home, wealthy men, immigrants, you know, more immigrants coming in, huge influx of immigrants. Yeah, I don't know why you guys are like ready for this to be over. We're almost done. A little bit more. Comparisons in the early 19th century, you could compare regions, right? You could compare the North, the South, and the West. The North was industrialized, so it didn't have a need for slaves, heavily populated, lots of immigrant populations, and social mobility. You could, you know, move up from in class. The South is agrarian, relied on slaves, has a rigid class system, sparsely populated because it's more rural. The West is kind of varied in the economy, kind of avoids the issue of slavery. Lots of social mobility, lots of chances to like earn a lot of money. Small population, but it's growing. Question around what is the market revolution? The market revolution like is the first industrial revolution. So it's just that first wave of industrialization. Where do I access the replays? As long as you're inside Fiveable, you should see them on your left. They're all there. All the replays from the whole year and all my replays from last year too are all there. No worries. Constitutional interpretation is another thing that you could compare of how these different political parties interpreted the Constitution, right? So the Federalists, they would have interpreted the Constitution very loosely, right? that the federal government should have more power than the states. The U.S. should have a strong international presence. The Democratic Republicans were more strict, right? We should adhere to the Constitution directly, and the states should have more power than the federal government. The Jacksonian Democrats, there was a bunch of questions about the Jacksonian Democrats. They were very much about states' rights, increased presidential power, allowing for the veto, which they also led to white male suffrage. The Whigs were more like strong federal government, increased congressional power. They're all different, right? So you could get a question that's like comparing them. What is something that we should take time to study on our own? You should study the things you don't know. That's what you should study the most. Go back through these slides and take more time on the slides that you feel least comfortable with. All right. Oh my God. Still so many left. All right, wrapping it up, early 19th century, major changes, industrialization, end of slavery, more powers in terms of, the executive, judicial, and legislative branches becoming more defined. The territory itself is expanding. Conflict over slavery. Continuities, again, end up the same in every one. The American identity is increasing. Slavery, exploitative systems are increasing. Took notes on this and underlined things that you're uncomfy with. Good. All right, let's get into the end of the 19th century. Possible causation topics. Westward expansion. Why? Manifest Destiny. Homestead Act. More opportunities for mining, farming. MO is Missouri Compromise. Some of the effects of westward expansion were conflicts with natives, more immigration, railroads, harming of the environment. You could talk about Reconstruction. Causes of Reconstruction would be the Civil War, the actual issues of slavery versus states' rights. The effects of Reconstruction are that it restored the Union. It gave a lot of opportunities for former slaves. Also led to the rise of the KKK and new amendments for voting, for citizenship. Things that you could compare. You could compare the Union and the Confederacy. I mean, I don't know, just like the North and the South, the biggest things are like industry versus agrarian. You could compare the labor unions, right? The Knights of Labor versus the AFL versus the CIO, which then joins together with the AFL. The types of, basically like unskilled workers were not part of the AFL. The CIO here was accepting of African Americans. So differences in terms of like the labor unions and like what they're willing to do, how they wanted to fight. Kind of similar to like civil rights, right? Where you have some who are doing it more peacefully, some who are kind of like by all means necessary. You could compare the Gilded Age philosophies, the isms, Marxism, communism, socialism, anarchism, liberalism. This is a little bit more like world and Euro, but it's obviously a part of American history too. So just like making sure you know the differences between the isms. You won't get asked a straight up question about this, I don't think, but these are part of this time. Changes in the late 19th century, industrialization, end of slavery, the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing, cities are increasing, more government corruption, literally continuity, always conflict with natives, expanding west, continuities are tough to think of, huh? Feels like there's always more changes. There's a lot of changes in this time period too. This is a big shift. All right, let's get into the 20th century. So we've got two more time periods. Possible topics in early 20th century, you could talk about like global conflict, right? Causes for those global conflicts. You have remember the main causes from world history. So militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. You have national security threat, right? Like Pearl Harbor, like the Zimmerman telegram, right? So we're going to get involved when our national security is in danger. You just have this idea of like saving democracy in the world. Effects of the world wars is just, they're both great for the US economy, right? Because of all the mobilization that happens. And you have the US as an international power. The end of both, really. Progressivism and liberal economics. So you've got why do you have a progressive movement? Because you have an increase in corruption, because of the depression, because people's lives are not great, right? Living in a city in the early 20th century was pretty gross. And so people are going to fight back against that. The effects of progressivism, there are tons. You guys were just listing some muckrakers, even, the different acts that happen, Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, the direct election of senators, women's suffrage, labor reforms, prohibition, the New Deal, all these different pieces. Things you could compare in the early 20th century, you could compare presidential responses to crises, where you have like, the isolationists, Wilson, FDR, who was kind of a little bit of an isolationist in the 30s, even though he knew it was coming. He knew the World War II was coming. You have interventionists, right, like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Truman. You have like the laissez-faire presidents like Coolidge and Hoover, right? Let it happen. Government will stay out of the economy. Let it rise and fall as it's going to happen. Versus social welfare like FDR or Truman, where the government's going to get more involved. Is that really the only one I had? Yeah, other like comparisons of the early 20th century, there's got to be other ones. I mean, you could compare what else? What are other things you could compare? You guys are talking about yellow journalism a lot right now. You could compare the actual like different regions. You could compare, like, tough to think about things. Maybe you'll have an idea. I'll keep going. I'll come back. CCOT in terms of early 20th century, you could talk about, some of the changes in this time period, pop culture, science over religion, right? Like more reliance on like reason versus religion, modernism, African-American culture, like jazz, mass media, the US as a superpower, imperialism, interventionism, the actual restrictions on immigration that changed the demographics, and new opportunities for women and African Americans, and then conflicts because of those things. Some of the continuities is that there's like always like a liberal versus conservative push. There's always the patriarchy and white supremacy, although those are true for all the time periods. And now. And transition from agriculture to industry. So like there's just kind of the continuity is that things are always changing in terms of these things, right? Rural to urban. Is this the Great Migration? Yes, this is when the Great Migration is. So that would be like a change here. I guess I could have written just like migrations in general as a change, Great Migrations. All right, lastly, late 20th century. Some of the things that you could look at causes and effects for: Cold War happens because of this like communism versus capitalism, two superpowers, two spheres of influences. The effects would be around our foreign policy and containment, the proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam, the space race, which increases our technology and leads to really massive education reforms. Even like College Board. College Board was created in 1955. Like, this is the time when education was about beating Russia. So like what you are doing in taking these tests is what is, you can thank this time period for that. It's literally just to like create students that can help us win against Russia. And here we are still like in the same thing. This is why sometimes these exams feel outdated. This is why. So I'll wait till some of the other possible topics you could talk about would be like liberalism. I'm like waiting for this lag. Liberalism. So great, thanks. We're just part of the same thing. Liberalism would be, the causes of that would be the civil rights movement, the Cold War itself, right? How can we live in a society that we're saying we're better than the Soviet Union, except that we can't, people here are not equal, right? Like, how is that even okay? How can we say that we are giving a better, life for people when there's plenty of people in America that don't have a better life? And so that is a cause of liberal movements. The effects would be like these, Great Society, the different legislations and Supreme Court cases, feminism, second wave of feminism, LGBT reforms, or, liberation movements. Conservatism, the like backlash to that. So like the cause would be that it's a reaction to liberalism. The crises of the 70s were a cause, Watergate, all different, those things, different crises around that. The effects were tax cuts, the rise of the religious right, traditional values. Oh yeah, conservatism could definitely be an effect of liberalism. I should totally write that on there. No, you're totally right. It is. I mean, it exists before that, but the rise of conservatism is an effect of the rise of liberalism, for sure. Mass incarceration would be an effect of conservatism because you have new crime bills that create strict laws around like drugs, specifically crack cocaine and weed, which incarcerate, millions. And then comparisons. Come on, no. Things you could compare the actual tactics for social reform. So like nonviolence versus like violence. And this is not just in civil rights. You also have like the Weathermen, who were the anti-war, but more about like violent measures, just like by all means necessary. It's not that I want to be violent. It's that I'm willing to be violent. Cold War policies, you could compare like kind of the different decades of the Cold War. I'm not going to run through each one of these decades, but you just kind of have this like shift from contain communism to be more aggressive to like, oh no, we almost blew up the entire world. We should probably slow down, right? Everyone slow your roll. And then the 80s to like, we need to end this. And so there's a real push to actually end it in the 80s. This has got to be the most concise like bullet points of the Cold War that like I totally even forgot that I even had this like that. Perfect. And last but not least, changes in the end of the 20th century, social movements, new technology, more power for the presidency, which also leads to distrust, complete changes in demographics. Like we are, Americans now are younger, are more diverse, are more biracial, are more just informal with how we act because of the different revolutions. Continuity, the U.S. as a superpower, also patriarchy, also white supremacy, also treatment of natives. And that's it. Just focus on the big things. Like they really did a lot of changes on these tests to make them more, approachable. And it's more about the like big ideas rather than the, like tiny little details. And so tell your friends about Fiveable if this was helpful for you. You know, we're really trying to grow something here. A lot of you guys have been here since the beginning. So this was really fun for me to like see you guys again. I know you were here last. Hit us up if you need anything. You know, there's a little chat bubble there for you. Send your questions to us. Tweet at us. Like literally all we do, we are in a Fiveable house now and we just are helping students with. All right, see you later. Have a good night. Get some sleep. Don't stress too much. Keep yourself healthy and happy. All right, see you later. Peace.